Welcome to another episode of the No Money But Dreams podcast. Today, I'm very fortunate to have Ryan on the podcast. It will be a very interesting conversation, hopefully, for lots of different people. We have actually met very recently.
Yeah.
Have had a couple of conversations, but I think it's fair to say that we clicked kind of right away, and there'll be some interesting stories to share. So maybe without further ado, give us a little bit of an introduction of who you are and what got you to this point today.
Okay, yeah. So now my name is Ryan. I'm working in a portfolio style career. So I have a few different strings to my bow. A large part of that is in the executive coaching space, doing leadership programs in companies, also partnering with a few big companies, off-site retreats. I do some Tibetan art consulting. I'm also doing some off-market deal flow for high-end residences and hotels in London. So kind of a mixture. But my background is probably what's more unique and probably why you wanted me here today. I was a Buddhist monk for about 10 years. Mm-hmm. So during my teenage years, early teenage years, I was practicing Buddhism quite intensively. I did long periods of silent meditation retreat, actually about a year in total. And then after that, I became a monk, and as a monk, I taught internationally, building communities in different places.
Okay. Yeah, that is definitely a very interesting kind of background. Tell us a little bit about being a monk and some of the experiences that you went through in those 10 years.
So I think, prior to being a monk, one of the most transformative pieces of my life was this time in silent reflection. So the silent part of the retreat, which people are very intrigued by, how can you, especially I like to talk, how can you have been silent for so long? The silent part is just a tool. The purpose of the retreat was more to go inwards, to remove distractions, and to really work on your own mind. So this is actually prior to being a monk. And my ordination was very much just an extension of a lifestyle that I was already pretty much living. So although I've been a monk around 10 years, I'd actually been living like that about 15. And for me, it was all about a life that was aligned with working inwardly rather than just externally. Ironically, when I became a monk, because I was quite knowledgeable and relatively popular within the groups that I was in, I was teaching a lot. So I actually went busier when I became a monk. So the period before was very precious to me because nobody knew who I was, very anonymous. I was just kind of having this time to really absorb this really profound wisdom and knowledge, to go inwards, became very close to a Tibetan monk who was my spiritual guide. And, that's probably the most transformative part of my life. And then a lot of the monk life was actually sharing that knowledge, deepening it through further practice. But very rarely did I get time to disappear and spend that time in complete solitary reflection for extended periods.
Mm. And you say this as if this is very common, 6 months, no talking. And how old were you when?
So the first period was for a month, and I was 16 years old. So that was, quite a number of years ago now. And that was probably more challenging in a way because I'd never done it for that long before. I think prior to that, the longest I'd done was 4 to 10 days. But after I'd done the month, I kind of really felt, that I understood a little bit the rhythm of how that works and going inwards in that way. And so when I did the 6 months, that was relatively easy by comparison because it was just 6 times what I'd already done. And after the 6 months, had I had the means to, I would have actually done longer.
Mm. So, 6 months and just studying and getting better and finding inner kind of peace. What kind of teachings have stuck with you since then? And how do you still use that in a day-to-day? Because I feel today it's so difficult to sit still for 10 seconds and go to the bathroom without having your phone, right?
Yeah.
Let alone 6 months of none of these kind of distractions. And I feel this is very interesting to me because if you can focus on something for 6 months and not get distracted, that's such a powerful thing to have in today's culture where you get distracted 100 times during the day.
Yeah, well, actually, the purpose of the retreat was you choose a topic of focus. So I chose a specific Buddhist practice that I had a connection with. That part of the aim is to go deeper with that, but also a large part of the process is about developing concentration. So I was actually spending that 6 months enhancing concentration, overcoming distractions. And so you talked about study. Actually, you're supposed to do the study beforehand. So I prepared 3 years between the 2 retreats for that second retreat. And you actually don't do much reading during the retreat itself, because even that can be distracting. You're supposed to focus exclusively on the practice. You have no phone, no music, no eye contact. I also did 1 meal a day for most of that period as well. So it was very, very powerful. And I think what it showed me was the capacity of our mind. And things like memory improved a lot post-retreat. So for example, a book about this thick, I was able to memorize verbatim, following on from that retreat, having read it a few times, and still to this day can remember that text. And so I think we don't realize how little of our mental energy we apply to the tasks we do. So I think for anybody, you don't have to disappear for 6 months, but just spending time cultivating some degree of concentration, being able to remove distractions, just unlocks this huge power and capacity of the mind. And then actually, a lot of tasks that take us a long time, we can do very quickly, because they take us a long time because we're so distracted. I don't know about you, if you're writing, say, an article, for example, like, you start, then you go to the bathroom, take your phone with you, like you said, get distracted, come back, then think, okay, I need to drink something else. And, there's this concept now that people are very popular with, which is like deep work, going really intensely. This was like 6 months essentially of pure deep work. And I think what was really powerful about that is that it showed me the power of the mind. And, I wouldn't say I've retained all of that level of focus post-retreat, but there's definitely a lot that stayed with me. And I think, a theme that I would like to for sure carry throughout my life is, which is integral to Buddhist teachings in general, is the focus on the mind. So, for example, when you're having a conversation with somebody, yes, your words matter, but what really matters is what's in your heart. And, I think as we go into a world of artificial intelligence and we have all this sort of prompts that can produce, probably more articulate language than we as humans can even put together sometimes, especially as it gets more advanced, even visual creations that an artist could never create by hand anymore. What really differentiates us as humans is what's going on inside. The artificial intelligence is artificial. It doesn't actually have a mind, doesn't actually have cognition. And so there is a quality that comes from our intention, from our compassion, from our insight, from our inspiration, from our wisdom, that is really going to be what makes us who we are and what brings the value to the table. And so I think for me, having that emphasis and growing that side of myself and continuing to try and grow that side of myself is something really important, and something that I would say everybody needs to do to some extent.
Mm-hmm. And so you've done that very early, before your 20s even started.
Yeah.
Wise beyond your age at that point, I'm sure.
In some ways, not in others.
In some ways. And then pretty much throughout your 20s, early 20s, you continue down this path. What were some of the other teachings that you took away that you now have for the rest of your life?
I think there's many, many things. I think one of the biggest ones is compassion, actually. And I think this is something I'm very passionate about, is that trying to perform all actions as much as possible governed by compassion. So exchanging places with the other person, and developing, a wish for their happiness, a wish for their alleviation of suffering, in the same way that one would normally only wish it for themselves. So I think having this compassionate intention, it just transforms the way in which you relate to people, and it makes even difficult situations more empowering. So even when you're stuck in a situation where you're suffering or you have some problems, if you can open your heart to compassion, even though it feels counterintuitive, I've got enough of my own to think about, it just shifts your perspective and brings a deeper meaning from that suffering, which you would never have normally taken if you'd focused just on yourself. And so I think compassion is a huge one. I think another is being able to see how much of what we see is a projection of the mind. Okay, so I think very often we really get fixed in our reality, and it's very difficult to see the perspective of people who are coming from a different space than we are. But when we start to see how our mind is projecting and creating our reality, and how by focusing on one aspect of a person or thing, we can completely distort our way of seeing it, we also see that actually our whole experience can be changed by changing the mind. Also, how we can have insight into how other people see the world, because it's coming from their mind, their projections. And I think, that focus of what's going on inside, rather than being too caught up with what's going outside, and having that longer term vision of my positive actions are going to produce positive results, understanding karma, These things are really, really important and something I really try to live by.
Mm-hmm. Compassion. I heard a bit of reflection out of there.
Yes.
How now that you're not a monk anymore, and we'll come to that story in a second, how do you use reflection to continue to grow as a human being?
Well, one very simple routine that you get into as a monk and also as a Buddhist practitioner who's sincere anyway, whether you're a monk or not, is you kind of start the day by establishing your intention and maybe even articulating vows or commitments that you've taken that are behaviors, actions that will align with that intention. So you start the day by creating this positive intention, and then throughout the day you try to be mindful of whatever it is you've decided to practice or engage in. For example, I will not harm others, or I'm going to be particularly patient with this person I find challenging. They can be quite specific or general. And then at the end of the day, having a process of reflection where you see, okay, how mindful of that practice was I? Did my day live up to the intention I'd set? And then thinking, recognizing the good things you did, appreciating and rejoicing in those, recognizing where it went wrong, and then maybe trying to make a plan or a renewed intention to improve the next day. So that's something that I got into the habit of doing on a very personal level. And it's something that I actually carry even into mundane tasks. I try to have a clear objective at the start, clear identity of okay, this is what I'm trying to accomplish. Try to be mindful of that throughout the process. And at the end, sort of reflect, how did it go, what went well, what didn't? How can I then sort of either realign or adjust or renew that intention at the end and then repeat the cycle again. And I think another thing you get with Buddhist training is there's a lot of repetition. I mean, for that 6 months, I was doing the same practice 6 times a day for about 10 hours a day for 6 months. But the words don't change for the prayers that you're reciting. The meditation doesn't change. You do the same one. You commit to one meditation. You're going to really enhance and refine through that process. You don't mix it up because you got bored. And you just go deeper, 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 deeper. And I think repetition is something that, in our modern society, we literally don't even finish a TikTok video. Even this, probably someone's about to swipe this podcast interview to the next one. And so I think that ability to stick with something and repeat it until you've learned the skill is something that I think is very useful.
Yeah, it's very close to, Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours until you can master anything, right? And I agree. I mean, repetition is one thing that a lot of people could do a lot more from, whether it's in the gym or whatever aspect of your life. If you keep repeating something, at some point your skill level will just increase automatically. And it's not just about, I like doing this. No, I gotta get the reps in, otherwise I'm not improving here.
Yeah, and a little and often is often enough as well. For things like meditation, retreats, I talked about, I've done a maybe unusually long period of time, but actually many people these days. I started recently doing some fitness classes at a gym that has a boxing focus. Obviously, do no harm is kind of a principle of mine. So I'm not actually fighting anyone directly, but I'm just doing the training. And the big guy boxer who was professional boxer, he was like, I'm not going to be here next week. I'm doing a 10-day retreat. So it's many people from lots of different parts of society recognize the benefit of this. But the culture at the moment is very much, it's great that people want to go inwards and they want to have a more spiritual side, but it's kind of like, taking the approach that we do with the partying to spirituality. If you want this intense, short experience that's going to give you something straight away. So go on an ayahuasca retreat or do a 10 days, having never done any meditation, having never really looked into that indigenous culture and understood what their principles are. And so actually, when you remove the context and you just go super intense into something, you don't really get any depth. You just get a peak experience if you're lucky, or you kind of get a spiritual tourism experience. So I think, I would always say to someone who wants to do a 10-day retreat, well, I would learn how to meditate for a few months, do 10 minutes a day for 12 weeks. And then, you're going to get more out of that in the retreat. If you do the retreat, that retreat's going to build on those 12 weeks, and then you're going to go deeper. Otherwise, you're just going to be learning and battling a new skill in a very probably overly intense environment. And from a meditating point of view, 10 days of intensity when you're brand new could actually even cause imbalances. It's not necessarily healthy. Just like with fitness, you can do a quick transformation, but it's actually your diet and exercise over a long period of time that is going to have the bigger impact.
This is a really interesting point, and I gotta be very selfish here and ask you something, but meditation is something that I haven't gotten into yet, and I have a very creative, racing mind, and I find myself a lot of the times, if I do something where I become creative in the evenings, I find it very difficult to sleep, and then I have thoughts until 2, 3 a.m. in the morning,
Yeah.
or I wake up at 4 a.m. in the morning just to go to the bathroom, and then I can't fall back asleep, and my mind just gets going, right? So I want to get to the point where I can just be still and get a lot more reflective without having these thoughts keep popping into my head. What would you advise to someone like me that hasn't really practiced meditation yet? How could I start developing this skill? Is it very similar to, for example, writing? During COVID, I picked up writing, and for an hour a day from 8 to 9 in the morning, I just was writing, right? And at the beginning, when there's a blank page, you're kind of, apprehensive, and you don't want to do it. But I forced myself to be in that chair every day for an hour, and that's how I became very good at writing. And then a blank page is no problem anymore because you just get going. So I wonder whether this is something that is transferable into meditation. But I really want to kind of get going with this. What would you say I should start focusing on?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to understand meditation is a skill set that, again, is used in context. So actually, meditation is just a very small part of, say, Buddhist training. And actually, the bigger part of the training is how you carry what you gain in that session into the rest of your life. Mm-hmm. The actual meditation itself doesn't need to be super long. There are also many different types of meditation, some that use a more creative, sort of contemplative process of thought, some that are more single-pointed, generally a combination of the two. So there's many different types, very, very broad, but I would say a very universal meditation, not even technically a Buddhist meditation, it's kind of used by other traditions and stuff as well, is focusing on the sensation of the breath. So just doing a very simple identifying the sensation of the breath as it enters and leaves the nose, slightly cooler inhale, slightly warmer exhale, not forcing the breath. What we often do is when you start doing this, you end up breathing differently because it's easier to focus on. You don't want to do that. You want to breathe normally through the nostrils and then identify the subtle, natural sensation of the breath. And then once you've found it, which takes a bit of focusing, first of all, just to even find it, then you kind of place the mind on it, try to be mindful of it, maintaining the continuity of that cognition moment by moment, bringing the mind back when it wanders. And then training to basically learn to hold the mind on the breath for 1 minute, 2 minutes, maybe even begin with 30 seconds, up to about 5 minutes. And this can be done just by training in like a 10-minute session every day. And I think, yes, having a routine where you give yourself a period of time is really useful. I think another way of making that feel less intense, because 10 minutes of meditation can feel very long for a beginner, is when the mind becomes completely lost and distracted, like if you've completely forgot you were meditating. Rather than sort of battling the mind back, is relaxing the mind and then almost beginning like a new subsection, like treating it as a fresh meditation. And then being able to go back, and over time you'll notice that you need to do that less and less because the mind's focused. So that is a really useful skill, and the goal is to have a single pointed mind. So you don't want to be one of these people who are like, oh, I have my best creative thoughts during meditation. They're distractions. Even if like Buddha appears in your meditation, that's a distraction. If the object is the breath, that's the only object of focus. And this is a really useful way to gain that ability to still the mind. And if you do that prior to another task, your mental cognitive ability is enhanced dramatically. And I find it amazing that even people in the world who've accomplished amazing things actually can't focus their mind for 5 minutes on the breath. What if they could? You know? Like actually, we have very little mental control generally as humans. Unless we've actively trained, our mind is like wandering, like a wild elephant, as in the scriptures it's described as. If you gain that ability to actually still the mind and focus it at will, then that concentration is just the tool. Then you can apply it to binding your mind to love, binding your mind to compassion, binding it to wisdom, developing insight into the nature of reality, and then using that experience to massively enhance your life. And when your mind becomes governed in that way, whenever you're speaking, that speech is imbued with the quality of the mind you've cultivated. And so you can then carry that positive experience into your work life, into your relationships. It's hugely impactful. But to answer your question, I would just say like 10 minutes a day, simple breathing meditation, great place to start. And noticing when the mind becomes distracted, bringing it back, finding a balance of not being too tight with the mind, but not being too loose. So having that relaxed but firm focus. And that's all about practice.
And how long you mentioned 90 days before, like is that a good kind of period where you say, okay, if you can go past these 90 days, 10 minutes every day, that would be a good kind of, like you could get to that point where then 10 minutes feel a lot more at ease?
So there are actually like stages of meditation, like stages of concentration specifically, they're called mental abidings, where you can actually sort of have a particular ability at each stage. The time at which that takes depends on individuals and depends upon their previous karma, depends upon other conditions, depends on how quiet the place is, for example. But I think rather than focusing on the goal, is focus on the method, okay? So it's like focusing on actually doing the practice and then allowing the results to come naturally in their own time, as long as it's going in the right direction, as long as you're seeing some improvement. If not, then it's adjusting, seeking advice from someone who's more experienced, and then going forwards. But I think, yeah, like 30 to 90 days is probably enough to start to see big changes. I think even in, again, outside of Buddhist context, just in general, from a habit forming studies perspective, like 30 days seems to be the benchmark for like an initial habit. And then it's like, I think 90 days like the next stage. And then I think it's like after a year, then it becomes like kind of an irreversible habit that you'd have to actually actively try to break.
Very interesting. So now let's go back to, okay, you've lived for a large part of your life as a monk. Then you transition out of this and you come back into the civilian world. Tell us about this process and how this happened for you and what you're now doing with your time.
Yeah, so this is an interesting part. I mean, you know, one of my friends was always like, so you're the monk who's going to buy a Ferrari rather than the monk who sold the Ferrari. This is a famous book, which I haven't actually read, but I've heard it was very good. So it's a little bit of an uncomfortable one, this question, to be honest, because I think, you know, I'd planned to be a monk for the rest of my life. And as we know, life is a lot messier than we'd planned, you know. So I didn't leave ordination life to pursue some pleasure or to make money or anything like that. It was actually a circumstance in which the founder, who was my teacher of the organization I was part of, had kind of retired and has subsequently more recently passed away. And the direction of the organization and the leadership team just their approach didn't really align with me and also my understanding of Buddhism and the direction I was going and how I was teaching. And so, yeah, it just came to a point where we separated. We took different roads. And, you know, I still have a lot of respect for them and I appreciate what I learned within the context of that group, not just from the teacher, but from the other people there. I didn't want to set myself up as a spiritual teacher, so hence why I haven't like set up a meditation center or, I mean, I had a big following I could have done that with. Instead, I wanted to take some time out to reflect. And, you know, at this point, without sort of that structure and support, if I was going to have to like work and do a civilian life, I was no longer a monk. And I thought rather than being in between stage, I just have to make a difficult decision and, you know, move forward in this new chapter. Took a lot of soul searching to think, okay, what on earth do I do now? I hadn't planned for this. I planned to be a monk until I was 100 if I made it that far. And, you know, over time, I spent some time reflecting, and, you know, the coaching and leadership programs was a translation of my skill set in presenting, teaching, working with people. And my background, of course, is interesting, but I was providing a different kind of service. And I also wanted to have, if I was going to be in the normal life, in civilian life, I wanted to have some secular credibility. I didn't want to be just like a left field, oh, this guy who used to be a monk, which is fun for like 10 years maybe, but I'm still pretty young. What about in 30 years? Oh, 30 years ago, he used to do something cool. It's not really a good story, and it's not really very sustainable. Plus, you know, I had a business when I was 12. The only reason I could afford to attend all the Buddhist festivals and, you know, travel that I did was because I had a business when I was 12 and I was selling products in about 4 different shops. I always had an entrepreneurial side. I even used that as a monk. You know, I was helping, you know, Buddhist communities to grow. I was organizing events for them. I was doing graphic design. Like I learned a lot of skills that were transferable. And so one of my good friends who I've known for a long time, he suggested that I do an MBA. I didn't even know what one was, to be honest. And, you know, when I looked into it, this kind of made sense. It was like a broad set of skills, looking at the whole kind of landscape of business, drawing on leadership experience I'd had as someone who was a teacher and working in communities. And I wasn't completely, you know, I wasn't in a cave the entire time. I was teaching in London, I'd done some stuff in New York. Like I'd been in cities as a monk and a little bit on the outside, but I had been there around people, supported people who were in those lives and had some vicarious understanding. And so this seemed like a good fit, but I was like, how on earth do I go to an MBA? And I felt like I wanted to go for a top school. You know, I'd meant to go to Cambridge before I left and became a monk. I'd been offered a place. So I was like, okay, I want to go for a top school. If I'm going to have to do it, I'm going to do it properly. How on earth do I get in? And so, to be honest, I just set that intention and I, started doing some study. I sat for the entrance exam. I would have required a scholarship because, it's very expensive, these programs. And then, without going into all the details, things just appeared. Like the flat I was living in, there was a guy above me during COVID. He ended up being like a venture capitalist, an elderly gentleman. I was bringing him food. During COVID, we kept in touch a little bit. He was writing a thesis for a philosophy degree he was doing, so he loved my background and we were exploring together. I proofread it for him. And then, when I told him of my aspirations, he was like, oh, I can introduce you to my friend who's a professor at London Business School. And then, as I was writing my application letter, my flat leaked and we got shouted at by the guy beneath us. And I had to do my sort of calm, peaceful influence on the landlord and the guy beneath and the agency that came to fix it, all these different things. Anyway, he was happy with how the whole thing was resolved and happened to be a McKinsey partner. So he ended up reviewing my application essay. And then one of my old students from when I was a monk, his friend, who's now actually on this trip with me in Dubai, who's become a good friend, was studying for an MBA at a different school. So he helped me prepare for my GMAT exam. And so all these things kind of came together. And I feel like when you have a good intention, you give a lot. When you are in a moment where you need to receive, it kind of just comes. And it's more than just like, the universe provides. That's not really the Buddhist views. It's more about our actions produce causes, and then our experiences are their effects. And they're not necessarily aligned directly. So it doesn't always, often there's a big period of time, even lifetimes, between those two things occurring. But I think if you practice generosity, which there's a big thing I try to live by, then, in those times of need, those things will be provided for. And then, I managed to get into the school, probably one of the youngest people in the class, because I wanted to go for the executive MBA. As a monk, most of my peers were 40 years older, so it didn't make sense.
So you have no undergrad, you have no master's, no nothing. You just went from monk to executive MBA.
Yes, but I did do a lot of work, that I could I had to really map out, year by year, what I'd done. Because as an executive MBA, you need generally 10 years executive experience and an undergrad. Ideally a GMAT, but not necessarily. So I did the GMAT to prove the academic capacity. I did 6 A-levels rather than 3 when I was in college, and I got 100% in a couple of them. So I had some academic credibility. And as a monk, I was kind of like a scholar in that particular Buddhist domain. It took a lot of convincing. But these days I think people do appreciate diverse backgrounds, that they appreciate people who are willing to sort of put their case forward. And it did take a lot of convincing, but eventually I was accepted.
Yeah, that's an amazing story. So now you're coming up to the finishing of your degree. What have you learned in this degree? How obviously you're much younger, but how are you different from these other people, and what was really easy for you and what was really challenging in the course for you?
Well, I think in terms of challenging, lots of challenging factors. So, if you're working full time and then trying to do this really extensive program, it's always a challenge. And you're always having to have competing priorities, which is part of executive training, isn't it? So I think that's by design. Yeah. I think, things like corporate finance, macroeconomics, data analytics, these don't feature in a Buddhist monk's training very heavily, So whereas things like executive leadership, even marketing to an extent, developing effective organizations and managers, this sort of stuff was much more natural to me. What I didn't realize though was that how throughout all of this, even for example in the accounting, how much things like presenting skills, being able to articulate ideas and simplify them, how valuable that was, and how actually I had developed those skills, maybe even more so than some other people in the group who had a very technical background and hadn't had much client-facing time or working with people individually. And so I think one of the things that I was surprised and encouraged by was the value of the soft skills, and actually how they are often the determining factor for some of the harder skills. We had a guy come in recently who was part of a recruitment firm. I think this is okay to share publicly, but they recently helped to appoint the new Starbucks CEO. Okay? And I think one of the differentiators for him was actually his empathy. They said that they had like 4 criteria that they analyze leaders on. It's like the acronym is CARE, which is creativity, agility, resilience, and empathy. And they were the distinguishing factors. And actually the last one, empathy, was what made him one step above the rest, who were already all very qualified for that role. And so I think that's been very, very encouraging. The network from the school has been incredible, like the alumni network, even including here in Dubai, because we have a campus here, has been really, really positive. It's like you're part of a new family. And I think for me, one thing I missed, having left the group that I was with prior, I obviously have some close connections I've kept that I'm still in touch with, but I needed to rebuild my life. And so I was very conscious of not just kind of being stuck in what I was doing before, because as a teacher, I'd met thousands of people, and I could have easily filled my time just meeting people who were still in the life I was in before. So instead, I kind of focused on building new relationships, and the business school has been a big part of that, and having this network and community that I could slot into, and even though I was very different, suddenly felt part of, was really nice to have like a place in the civilian world, which I didn't feel I had initially. So that has been, from a personal level as well, it's been very useful professionally. And I think, it'll be interesting to see where that journey goes, because obviously with the business schools, the idea is that you contribute to the alumni network and you keep going. I actually helped a couple of my colleagues to get roles through my network from outside the school. So that's been really positive and inspiring, and I hope to try and do the same going forwards.
So can I summarize and say that this new experience has really helped you to understand some of your skill set that you may have not actually believed that you had before, and
yes.
It kind of came out. Plus the network that you're now building is just really, really valuable and has given you a new place. I mean, it almost sounds like you really like to be part of an organization and like one piece of a bigger kind of organization and really contribute in those.
I think I like to, I would disagree with that. I think I like to be part of a community.
Okay.
I think I love my autonomy. So I was actually offered a full-time role at a big consulting firm recently and turned it down. Which, don't tell my mom, she'll kill me. But actually no, I think one thing I actually really value at this point in my life, having spent so much time in a religious organization, is complete autonomy. And that's something that for me is really important. I love partnering with groups and organizations, but I do have my own way of working, and which I'm continuously improving and developing. So I love my autonomy, but actually I think that sense of belonging from being part of a community, I think, is important. But again, I wouldn't want to be pigeonholed in that. I have a very broad network, and this is a part of my network, but it's not the entirety. So yes, I benefit from that community, but I wouldn't say that I like being part of just one organization. Yeah. I mean, actually, one of the topics we looked at in business school was this self-determination theory, or 3 keys for keeping employees engaged, for example. It's very simple, but it's very interesting. It's autonomy, belonging, and competence, like ABC. And so I think this is really interesting. Like at this point in my life, autonomy is something that I've really maybe lacked a little bit in the situation before, because you're representing a global organization. You have a very structured lifestyle that you have to live within the bounds of, which I loved. But autonomy was probably the restricted component. But I had very big belonging and strong sense of competency because I was knowledgeable and had experience as a monk. Whereas now it's been interesting, like, the competency factor, especially in business school, was low because, I'm having to do stuff like financial modeling, which I'd never touched before. So, but the sense of autonomy was very high. And then the belonging was reintroduced by having this sense of community with the school. So I think, we all have to have a different balance of these at different points in our life. And I think for me, autonomy is a big part of my personal satisfaction and well-being in my life. I love the fact that I can be here in Dubai for a month, and I don't have to ask permission from anybody to do so. Yeah,
which is what a lot of people after COVID are now striving for, or optimizing for, to have this autonomy factor in their life. Okay, so now you're coming to the end of your kind of degree. What's next? How are you going to integrate then into your next steps of life, and what's next?
So I think I mentioned before I have a portfolio career, so I have a few things going on right now. So I think in my main business, so in the coaching and leadership programs, I'm starting to establish more stronger bases with a few clients. Actually, one of my reasons for being here is that I'm expanding a little bit into the region. So I just signed a contract with a big consulting firm as a SME, so subject matter expert. I'm going to be working with some of their clients in Saudi, Bahrain, Kuwait, Dubai, Oman, even some government contracts. I'm going to be doing some stuff directly myself with some clients, some like off-site team building retreats and things like this. And some of the hedge funds that I work with in London, we've renewed our engagement terms and looking at building a longer term relationship together. So that's super exciting, really enjoyable. On the property side, which I'm a bit more discreet about, we are kind of relatively close to a hotel sale at the moment, which would be an interesting process to go through. And if that were to occur, that capital would give me some opportunities to explore other avenues, maybe even some acquisition of some smaller companies and growing cash flow businesses on a more passive side with some executive support. And more kind of pro bono generally. I get approached occasionally to consult on some Tibetan art pieces, and I might be helping with a private sale in the US for a client to actually sort of make sure that everything is correctly identified and presented in a way that's contextually appropriate to respect the pieces and their origin.
Mm-hmm. I mean, definitely portfolio career. Okay, definitely came out of that. Okay, so you told us what you're doing on a day-to-day, but obviously it's a big change from where you were a few years ago to where you are now. And now you seem very much like someone, just like me and you, that has grown up and is now striving to improve their life. And there must be a materialistic part to it as well. How are you, with your past, trying to integrate that? Is there an internal struggle ever to...
Yeah, of course there is. And I think, to be honest, like there's people who even, will judge me more harshly or in a different way than they would judge even themselves or others just because of my background. And I think, put it this way, I don't know whether this is logically sensible or not, but I was like, I'm very wholehearted in what I do. And so I still practice Buddhism, I still engage in spirituality. But for example, if I was to live a monk life, I didn't watch any television, I didn't listen to music, some of them did in their bedroom. I didn't, I was very strict in the way that I applied my life as a monk. And I was very disciplined and I didn't break any of my vows, ever. So I was very, very disciplined. But that was in the context of me living as a monk, which itself served as a purpose to support particular lifestyle I was having. Now, if I'm going to have to be a civilian, I'm going to do a normal lifestyle, then I'm going to want a nice one, to be very honest, because, I think also there's this idea, sometimes I think people who've been in Buddhist communities think that as a spiritual practitioner, the more spiritual route would then be to be stacking shelves, doing some humble, mundane job or something like this. And there's nothing wrong with that. But actually, for me, okay, so say if I scenario build it in my mind, I was like, okay, say I do this, I'm going to be working just to eat all the time. And then actually a lot of stress and anxiety comes with that. And your mind's occupied actually more about where's money coming from. And actually some of my mental skills I wouldn't be using, maybe become a bit duller over time with that. And actually at the end of a day of doing a physically hard job or like very long hours, you're exhausted, you've got no energy to study, meditate, practice in a formal way. Mm-hmm. So for me, it was like actually capitalizing on my skill sets, doing something that I feel inspired, that is not going to harm people, but brings value, also can create some material value, then gives me freedom to explore all the other stuff. Like one thing I never got to do as a monk was actually go and visit some of the pilgrimage sites, like in Tibet and India. And so next year, I'm turning a milestone year in my life. I'm going to do a little bit of pilgrimage time and actually go and see some of these places and on my own and have some connection with that, which so all that features in my life. And for me, money and these things is just a tool to be able to accomplish what I do. It also determines how generous I can be on a material level. So I have, some philanthropy ambitions in the future. And I think it's also important to remember that even when I was a monk, I was teaching lots of wealthy people, actually, in London, for example, And of course, to do that effectively, you've got to believe that these people can really fully engage and embrace the practices. Otherwise, what's the point? Mm. And so, even in historical Buddha's time, he was teaching kings. There's a whole collection of advice of Buddha's advice for kings. Many of the scriptures that are written are actually working with these royal family members. Buddha himself was a king who gave up his position but still had the education, eloquence, and all these qualities that enabled him to help the people in a worldly sense, in line with his spiritual qualities. All the big events where you have 5,000 monks, they were sponsored by patrons. They weren't. You don't feed 5,000 monks from nowhere. So throughout the entire Buddhist history, there were examples of Buddhist practitioners from the lowliest people in society to the wealthiest. You know, even in one of the prayers, it says like Brahmins, outcasts, pigs and dogs are of one nature. So it's very leveler. It's more about what's going on inside. Okay, so there are, you know, Emperor Ashoka, many of these, you know, Buddhist kings, for example, were able to practice great generosity. I'm probably not going to reach that level of wealth in my lifetime, but yeah, I do have material aspirations, but I also have spiritual ones. And, you know, for me, there isn't necessarily a contradiction between these two. But I agree, if I get too lost in that, it's something I'm very aware of. And, you know, I try to always keep my values that I've had, you know, from before and carry them with me now.
The podcast is called No Money But Dreams. What are some of your dreams that you're trying to realize over the next few years?
I think, you know, from, like, I would say an internal dream is to, you know, develop certain spiritual realizations that I believe will unlock the power of my mind and increase my capacity to help other people. So they're very specific ones within, you know, sort of the Buddhist trainings, but for instance, developing certain levels of concentration, developing a more universal compassion, developing really strong resilience. So this is something I definitely have as the vision for the future self that I would like to be. On a material sense, I'm someone who's always appreciated aesthetic beauty in environments. So I was actually going to study architecture at Cambridge. And so, you know, it's a very basic thing, but especially having lived as a monk where you only have one room, you know, I think I want to own and sort of, you know, deck out a very beautiful home that has this sort of aesthetic beauty and that also actually has many features tied in, like a shrine room, etc., with my background, and create this beautiful sacred space that for myself and for my friends and family to enjoy. I think, you know, financial freedom is a big thing for a lot of people, and I think, of course, I would love to have an amount of wealth that would enable me to not have to think about it too much and to be able to give in the way that I want to and to enjoy the life that I would like. And also, you know, to be able to particularly provide for my family. You know, my mum particularly has been, hi mum, you know, it's a typical shout out, has been a very influential part of my life. You know, she wasn't really given any opportunities education-wise. Although I sound maybe slightly more, my accent's maybe different. I'm from a part of Northern England that's not, you know, not very wealthy, and I grew up with parents on minimum wage. You know, not struggled a little bit in childhood to be able to have access to things some of my friends did. But my mum was incredible. Like, she would always, you know, do everything she could with the resources she had. She would take us on nature walks. She'd make up games. Like, she'd do so many creative things with us. And I think, you know, I would love for her to have the retirement she deserves and to, you know, stop working as soon as possible and to be able to have a really comfortable end of her life, you know, for the hopefully long end of her life. And so that's also a big aspiration, is to give back to my family, particularly my mum. Yeah,
that's a beautiful way to end our discussion. I mean, I think we could go on for another 2-3 hours easily. But we'll leave it here. Thank you so much for coming on, and
thank you.
Good luck with your next chapters.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.